To keep or not to keep? That is the question. Welcome everyone, StealthyShiroean here, and today I'm bringing you an episode of Wishlist Reviews. If you missed my previous episode where I take a look at some management games, then check the card above. Anyway, I'm someone who has a ridiculous wish list, which is now sitting at 350 games. Every now and again, I like to go through the games on my wish list and reassess if I'm still interested in them. So join me in seeing whether or not these games are worth keeping, or maybe you'll find something that will make its way onto your wish list. Starting off, I played the demo for Luto. The pitch for this is a psychological horror game where you're stuck in your house and you're unsure about what's reality and what isn't. On paper, this sounds amazing and is the kind of horror that I greatly enjoy. However, there were more than a few things that marred my experience with it. First, I had performance issues straight out of the gate, at least on the high graphic settings. I think it was partially because of the film grain and the aggressive motion blur. Unfortunately, there were no individual options to shut those off. After dropping the settings to medium, I noticed the film grain went away and motion blur was reduced, which resulted in better performance. However, even on those settings, I still had some weird graphical hitches like flashing lights on the side of the screen. Once I straightened that out, I got to playing the game and, well, it just wasn't really that scary. For a couple of reasons. The atmosphere was decent and creepy, or at least when I wasn't walking around in circles. The game has some puzzles to figure out, and none of them were that difficult. The issue I had was constantly missing items that were on the ground. There were a couple times when I searched all over the entire house several times before finally coming across the item that I needed to find. It was too easy to miss items, and the game doesn't do much to nudge the player in the right direction. There was a help button, but it was beyond useless. As for the scares, to the game's credit, it doesn't really use jump scares, but I just wasn't that scared of a dude in a white sheet. He'd periodically show up to give me a spook, and that was about it. I didn't feel like it felt psychological in the sense of someone questioning their reality. The biggest thing that took me out of the experience was the knowledge that there was no fail state. There was no health, so I knew that I couldn't die from getting hurt, and there was no sprint, so more than likely there was no real chase sequences in which I could get caught. And for the record, I felt the walk speed was super slow when coupled with the amount of times I walked around the entire house. Anyway, this reminded me a lot of the original Layers of Fear I played and reviewed a couple years back. I never needed to worry about the scares because my character didn't need to worry about self-preservation. Despite creepy things happening, or a monster appearing, or whatever other horrific thing going on, I knew that none of these things were truly bad for my character. I found myself walking towards the questionably scary guy in the sheet rather than staying away, which I'm sure is not supposed to be the desired response in a horror game. So, to answer the question of to keep or not to keep, it is not to keep. Obviously, this isn't a surprise. I wish the developers well with the release date near the end of the month, however, I'm realizing that walking sim horror games, as this one is really close to being, just don't work for me. The concept is compelling though, so maybe this is actually one to check out for someone else. Next up is staticdread the Lighthouse, a game about being a lighthouse keeper. Your job is to guide ships, make sure the lighthouse stays operational, and take care of yourself so you could actually carry out said tasks. Obviously, this won't be as straightforward as it sounds, given that it's a horror game. The game starts off with a global phenomenon that has occurred with an aurora affecting all electronics. The lighthouse, which had been automated until now, is in need of a keeper, and that happens to be you. You leave your family to spend your time at the lighthouse and man it during these uncertain times, until which, I assume anyway, the phenomenon is supposed to end. The lighthouse has several things that might need to be checked during a shift in order to ensure ships don't crash on the rocks. Various switches and gears which I imagine will need to be troubleshooted at various tense moments. Although I usually just had the main switch flipping, which simply had me flipping it back to get things running again. However, that's not your only job. Throughout the night, ships will radio in and you'll need to find their channel. Once found, the captain will relay their information and you'll need to map a route for them to follow that leads them to an appropriate port. Sometimes it's the port they request, other times there may be other considerations you'll need to make on where to send them. Additionally, you need to make sure you're properly fed to keep your wits about you. You have to maintain a sharp focus to stay awake and keep your sanity up to, I'm not sure what, but I imagine having a low sanity would not be good. You could do this by eating certain foods, which can be bought by certain people visiting the lighthouse, and some supplies freely given by a courier every couple of days. I really like this aspect of the Lighthouse Keeper gameplay. Everything felt tactile as you could interact with a lot of different things. Even something like the oil lamp could be picked up and walked around to ward off darkness. I think the times when it felt jarring is when interacting with a couple rooms in the lighthouse that I couldn't physically move through, but were just backdrops. Although, this isn't just a game about being a lighthouse keeper, so how's the horror elements? For me, I thought they were perfect. The game does such a good job with immersion and building atmosphere, and the horror elements fold perfectly into that. In true Lovecraftian fashion, the horror is a slow burn. Obviously, the aurora itself and the ethereal look through the windows is enough to tell you that things are a bit unsettling. When scouting for frequencies on the radio, you might also pick up odd radio waves that suggest certain things are happening out there. On top of that, the lighthouse attracts a variety of different people to it, and some of them definitely seem to be more than meets the eye. However, the most antagonistic horror element is this entity that calls you and seems to not want you there. Or possibly wants to help? It's confusing and horrifying in the sense that the entity does a good job to heighten the tension. You know that bad things are going to happen, but you don't know when or how. And I loved it. Growing dread, increasing paranoia, and a questioning of reality are all aspects of horror that I enjoy, and Static Dread seems to interact with all of these. To answer the question of to keep or not to keep, my answer is to keep. I played for about an hour with more of the demo left, but I quit early only so that I could experience it in the full game. I enjoyed my time playing this a lot and can't wait to give the full game a shot in the future. For those also waiting to play the game, it will be released at the beginning of next month on August 7th. Before I get into the final game, if you're enjoying the video or found it helpful, then please consider giving this video a like and subscribing for more video game coverage in the future. Finally, I took a look at Total Chaos. Originally, I had selected 3 games that were all going to release within the next few weeks. Total Chaos was slated for a July 25th release date, but it's since been pushed back to Q4 of this year. Without arbitrarily finding another horror game to add to my wishlist that would come out in the next few weeks, I decided to go ahead and give this one a whirl. What Total Chaos is, or maybe I should start with what it was. Apparently, Total Chaos is the reimagining of a popular Total Conversion mod for Doom 2. It's a survival horror title with a much greater emphasis on the survival aspects, as players will need to manage more than just their health and how much ammunition they have. After the prologue, I noticed 2 things right away. The first was just how large the field of view was. I suppose the default setting, which I think was 90 or 100, I can't quite remember, is probably good for some shooters. I don't really think it makes much sense in a horror game though. I knocked that down to 80 and it seemed better. The second thing I noticed was how fast the movement speed was, but given the game's original source, I can understand that. Actually, it works out well since there is no sprint button. The first couple chapters have you exploring Fort Oasis. Through these narrow corridors, you'll scavenge for supplies to repair and craft equipment, and consumables to maintain your player's resource bars, being health, bleed, hunger, and madness. I know it was only the beginning of the game, but I thought it felt too linear, which was weird to me. The game gives you all these supplies that you will basically come across with no issues, because there wasn't any going off the beaten path, so to say. All of the encounters felt measured to a point that you would always have the resources necessary to clear them, whether crafting materials for weapons or consumables to heal up after a fight. The game suggests the resources are valuable and not every encounter should be fought. However, I never felt the strain of any of this. The combat itself seemed alright and has you managing your stamina in a fight. You can attempt to parry or evade, as well as throw objects to momentarily stun the enemy. It's a good system, but I didn't feel it was overly difficult. I never once avoided a fight unless it was clear that you weren't supposed to fight to begin with, but I never had much difficulty. At least from first impressions, I'd say that unless you botch every encounter, then it may not be as resource stressful as it seems at first glance. As far as the horror goes, I thought it was okay. Personally, it didn't do that much for me. There were some, monster-like humanoids that you fight, and they were pretty much by the numbers, exactly what you'd expect from some sort of zombie. There were also some hallucination sort of jump scares that didn't actually make me jump, probably because they weren't overtly in your face rather than me having nerves of steel. I don't, full disclosure. Although, to be fair, I appreciated that about the jump scares. However, what the game does well is the claustrophobic feeling I had while roaming the halls of the fort. I never knew what was around the bend, if there was a monster, and what that might cost me resource-wise. Sometimes I felt these encounters were cheap, but the game telegraphed fairly well that it wasn't much of an issue. But anyway, the atmosphere was decent. Overall, the game felt alright for the most part, but it didn't really wow me. At least, that was until the game introduced the madness mechanic. Oh, and by the way, despite the game's slow start, I thought it did a great job easing the player into learning different mechanics, such as the importance of running versus fighting, weapon durability, and crafting. Anyway, in one particular part of the demo, there was nowhere to go and I was stuck. Instead, I needed to take some pills that healed me and raised my madness. At a certain point, you start seeing a different landscape and the environment changes, opening up new pathways. This was done really well, and I was constantly looking around to see what changed and where I could go. It was a clever mechanic that I think helped to set the game apart. So, to answer the question of to keep or not to keep, my answer is to keep. I think while it wasn't immediately impressive, it does enough things that still interest me. I definitely want to see how this game develops. One thing I hope to see when playing the full game is more interesting uses of the madness mechanic. Also, a more open area would make sense to me from the survival aspect of the game, since right now it seems way too easy to gather resources. I definitely enjoyed my time playing the demo though. If you played these demos, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you haven't, then let me know if these sound like something you'd be interested in, or if you have any other questions. I hope this video helped you in some small way, and if it did, then please consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe, or whatever it is you feel like doing. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.